Welcome to the 66th Annual Bishop Hurst Lecture, hosted by the Department of Philosophy and Religion at American University. My name is Jin Park. I'm professor and chair of the department. The Bishop Hurst Philosophy Lecture was initiated by the Department of Philosophy and Religion and named for the founder of American University, Bishop Hurst, who was himself a philosopher. In the flyer that you have on your chair, you see that all the 66 speakers, starting from all the way back in 1958, and the first inaugural speaker was Walter Kaufman. If you know philosophy, he is very well-known philosopher. And then we have Isaiah Berlin, Ernest Nagel, and so on and so forth. So over the years, we brought very distinguished philosophers to AU campus so that AU community can benefit from hearing from these well-known speakers and philosophers. Offered annually in the spring, and then we hosted to open to the entire AU community. So today's schedule is like this. I opened the event, and Professor Lauren Bice, who is the Director of Undergraduate Studies, will formally introduce the speaker, and then we will hear his talk, and after that, we will open for the Q&A. Okay, so when you listen to hear his talk, think about your questions. Before I invite Professor Weiss, let me read a land acknowledgement. American University is located on the territories of the Piscataway, Powhatan, and Nanticoke people. We recognize that our ability to gather here today is due to the continued occupation of this land. Bishop John Hurst, who founded American University in 1893, was a slaveholder in a post-emancipation economy. We recognize that American University benefited both directly and indirectly from wealth gained through slavery. In recognizing that this land is colonized indigenous territory that has been crafted through slavery and indentured labor, it is our collective responsibility to critically interrogate the histories and afterlives of these events and to honor, protect, and sustain this land. So now let me invite my colleague, Professor Lauren Bice, who is the Director of Undergraduate Studies.
Yeah? Thank you. Okay. So welcome. I am very pleased on behalf of the Department of Philosophy and Religion to welcome our distinguished lecturer, Dr. José Medina. Dr. Medina is the Walter Dill Scott Professor of Philosophy at Northwestern University with affiliations in African American Studies, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Spanish and Portuguese. He previously taught at Vanderbilt University and has held visiting appointments at Carlos III University of Madrid, Princeton University, and the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Medina works primarily in critical race theory, feminist and queer theory, applied philosophy of language, political philosophy, communication theory, and social epistemology. He has published 5 monographs, 5 edited or co-edited volumes, and over 70 articles and book chapters, and probably it's higher since this was drafted. His latest book, The Epistemology of Protest, Silencing, Epistemic Activism, and the Communicative Life of Resistance, was published with Oxford University Press in 2023. Previous books include The Epistemology of Resistance, Gender and Racial Oppression, Epistemic Injustice, and Resistant Imaginations, also published with Oxford University Press in 2013, which received the North American Society for Social Philosophy Book Award. His current work focuses on how social perception and imagination contribute to the formation of vulnerabilities to violence and oppression. These projects explore mobilizing social movements and activism, including what he calls epistemic activism, to resist racial and sexual violence and oppression in local and global contexts. Dr. Medina's current book projects on theories of oppression and resistance include the collection of essays Resistance for Oxford University Press and Communities of Resistance and Prefigurative Politics for Marquette University Press. Please join me in welcoming Dr. José Medina.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Lauren. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, everybody who has been involved in arranging my visit, and everybody has been so gracious. So thank you, everybody, for being here. This is a great crowd. Now, can someone give me a 5-minute warning when I'm running out of time? I just want to make sure that we have time for Q&A. What's that? How long is your talk? Well, it can be anywhere from 40 minutes to an hour and a half. So, no, it should be 45 minutes or so. Yeah. You'll give me, okay. All right, so let me tell you just a little bit about what you're gonna hear, and I wanna put the talk in context. So it is drawn from my book that came out last year, The Epistemology of Protest, but it goes beyond that book. But essentially what I wanna talk is about resistance under conditions of oppression. And what I have in mind is any kind of oppression, class oppression, racial oppression, gender oppression, and the claim, or the starting point really, the basic claim, the minimal claim is, it is very difficult to resist the form of oppression that you suffer when that is pervasive in your society. So, which means that if you are in a homophobic society or transphobic society, it's going to be very difficult for queer people, for trans people to protest in a way in which they are really seen and they are really heard. So that's the basic thing. Issues of visibility and audibility become very hard when oppression is pervasive. And that is true even if you live in the best democracy of the world, right? Even if freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, any kind of freedom is supposed to be guaranteed in your society, I'm claiming you still are going to have a hard time protesting an oppression that is pervasive and structural in your community. And I think that if you look at any movement of liberation, the queer liberation movement, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, I mean, any liberation movement, they have a really hard time being visible and audible in the right way. So that's the main thing that I want to start focusing on. Now, on top of that, we live under, and I want to acknowledge that too, we live under a time in which a lot seems to be changing. So even forms of political oppression that didn't seem to be in the horizon, now they seem to be in the horizon. Even things that we took for granted, such as freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, perhaps we shouldn't take for granted anymore because they are under attack or under the threat of being constrained in particular ways. So we should also talk about that. On the one hand, we have the obstacles that come with a structural oppression to begin with. That's going to be there, even if your civil liberties are guaranteed, even if you live in a great democracy. But then on top of that, there are also political constraints and political obstacles that you may have to face. And what I want to call attention to is that precisely those people who have a hard time being seen and being heard, they are in a special kind of case when it comes to protest, right? Because they are being silenced in many ways. Even before they even try to protest, they are encouraged not to be visible or audible. They are encouraged to act in a particular way, to participate in the public sphere in a way in which they have to hide themselves or sacrifice parts of who they are. So there are all these kinds of silencing. This connects with the book, right? I distinguish 5 different kinds of silencing. I'm not going to go over that because I don't want to bore you. But some of those can, even before people start to protest. Some of those forms of silencing have to do with making very difficult that people even form a social movement, that even assemble, even mobilize themselves as a public, right? So that's what I want to focus on, all those different kinds of silencing that become important when people want to protest. And what I want to emphasize, oh yeah, the lights, yeah, good idea, thank you. What I want to emphasize, and I'll do more that in the first section, is that there are forms of epistemic injustice that they suffer. And I can tell you more about that. I will, in fact, in a minute, in a few slides. But they have to do with what I was saying. ways in which their visibility and audibility are in question, right? And then I want to say that we have to fight against visibility and audibility, and that is what I'm going to call epistemic activism. So there is a particular kind of activism that in a way is an attempt to facilitate activism. It's like a meta-activism. It's an attempt to remove obstacles that people experience when they try to become activists. So this meta-activism, this epistemic activism, is trying to facilitate people's visibility and audibility so that they can become a public, so that they can protest, and so on and so forth. But I also want to call attention to, and I'll say much more about that sometimes there are traps that you have to make sure you identify and you overcome. And one of those traps is being trapped in a double bind so that whatever you do is not going to empower you. Either you become complicit with your oppression and you shut up and you don't protest, for example, or you protest, but then that protest is used to undermine your own agency. It goes back against you, and it doesn't empower you. I'll say more about this, but I will focus on all of that in the first part of the talk. And then the second part of the talk will be more about the specific kinds of protest and how we can understand those specific kinds of protest, and even protest techniques like the die-in or the kiss-in that I'll tell you more about. How those kinds of protests could be understood as ways of resisting the oppressive double binds that I'll tell you about in the first section. By the way, let me just also mention that there are many different kinds of activism, and in the Q&A we can explore as many kinds of activism and protest movements as you want. For the talk, I'm going to focus on two kinds: anti-racist activism, Black Lives Matter, civil rights movement, and so on, and queer activism. Those are the two main kinds I'm going to be focusing on for the purposes of the talk. And then finally, after those two sections, I'll say a little bit about what I think are important and interesting claims about communicative solidarity in the light of the argument that I present to you. Okay, so first part, resistance, epistemic injustice, and epistemic activism. So these are at least three very important things that we should think about when we think about resistance. And when we think about individuals and collectives developing resistant agency so that eventually they become a counter-public. For some reason, my clicker is not, the pointer is not working. I was pointing there. Okay. So what is it that people have to do to become a counter-public, a protesting public? And what kind of resistant agency do they have to develop? I think there are these three things that become really crucial. First, when they are in a position of invisibility, inaudibility, they are not being seen, they're not being heard, they have to break that silence, right? And part of that is giving testimony about their problems, giving testimony about their suffering and their social marginalization. Then the second thing that is crucial is that they overcome the mainstream culture, the mainstream frameworks in which they cannot be heard and they cannot be seen, and they develop their own ways of making sense of their experience. That would include like new language. Like, for example, in any social movement of liberation, in any protest movement, you will see, and Michelle Moody Adams has a book that also came out last year that focuses on this. You can see in every social movement, in any protest movement, new language. Like the queer movement gave us all kinds of language: homophobia, transphobia, non-binary identities, polyamorous relationships. The women's movement gave us a lot of different concepts and new language, like sexual harassment and so on. Okay. That becomes crucial as well. That's part of the resistant agency, right? And then number three, you also want to develop agency in a resistant way and to empower yourself by changing the communicative dynamics. And that can mean many different things. For example, if some people have the control over public discourse, if some people are being heard all the time, you actually want to silence them a little bit, right, to make a space for other voices. You want to say, hey, let's make sure that other people, can participate. Let's make sure that we address other questions. Let's make sure that we imagine our present conditions and also our future conditions in different ways, okay? And that may have to do with changing communicative dynamics. Okay. Now, if you are with me so far, you we'll see very quickly how the issue of epistemic injustice or epistemic marginalization comes in. It has to do with making sure that people don't do these three things. So for the first one, people come out and give testimony about themselves, but they are not being heard. They are being discredited, for example. They are not believed, right? And testimonial injustice, as I understand, this language, by the way, comes from Miranda Fricker, and I do follow her framework, but I expand it a little bit. So for me, testimonial injustice happens even before people give testimony. For example, when they try to give testimony and they can't, when they are discouraged from giving testimony. You are not a testifier, you are not giving testimony, but you are suffering testimonial injustice because you are being inhibited, right? Your voice is being inhibited, you are discouraged, but then of course it happens when you give testimony and you are being discredited completely. And people don't believe you. Or even if they do believe you, they do nothing with that, right? No uptake of the right kind. It doesn't result in a benefit from you. It doesn't lead, okay. All of that could be forms of testimonial injustice. Then for the second one, sometimes when people try to make sense of themselves, their experiences and their situation in new ways, they are blocked, right? The language that they propose, it doesn't receive any uptake. It's even blocked, and that can be hermeneutical injustice, right? People don't give you the opportunity to use new language, new concepts, or even when you do use it, people distort your concept so that it is used against you. I mean, even part of the discussion about DEI, right, could be taken in this way, right? Now it becomes something else, not what you meant to say or whatever. So these are forms of hermeneutical injustice. Or even simply, you know, women in the women's movement proposing sexual harassment as a concept, and that not receiving any uptake from the law. So people having a hard time including that in the legal regulations or whatever it is, right? Or people in the queer movement proposing new language, like non-binary or whatever, and then again, that being blocked. That is hermeneutical injustice for me. Okay. And then finally, if you're trying to change the communicative dynamics in the ways I was explaining, making sure that some voices are heard, making sure that the voices that control public discourse are not heard in the same way, that can be blocked as well, and that is what we call in the literature, and this comes from my colleague Jennifer Lackey, but also from myself in the last 5 years, working in prison activism and in prison education, we came up with this label, agential epistemic injustice, which has to do with the epistemic injustice that you receive when you cannot exercise your agency, or when you exercise your agency, it is used against you. And that happens a lot in the American criminal justice system. Police interrogations are set up in such a way that the person under interrogation has no agency. And not only that, the little agency the person may have is used against the testifier. I can tell you more about that, but essentially is what happens when you either don't have agency or your agency is used against you. Okay. If you are on board so far, right, you can see what are the problems that I'm calling epistemic problems that protesting voices and oppressed counter-publics could face. What epistemic activism is the fight against those problems, right? And what does that mean? Well, for the first one, if people cannot give testimony, or when they do, they are discredited and so on, what we need to do is to empower these voices so that they can testify and their testimony receives uptake. And that is what I would call testimonial empowerment, right? There are many examples of this. Probably a very obvious one is the Me Too movement, right? Women were having a hard time testifying about their sexual harassment, their sexual abuse, their sexual assault. They were discredited when they did so, and the networks of women started getting together, supporting each other's testimony, empowering themselves as testifiers, this testimonial empowerment. And then other people too, even outside the Me Too movement, said, yes, we need to listen to women and we need to believe women when they, okay, so that's testimonial empowerment, okay. Then for the second one, what we need is hermeneutical empowerment. What does that mean? We need to be committed to empower those subject positions that have a hard time when they propose new language, new concepts, new ways of making sense of themselves. We have to give them uptake. We have to use the language that they propose to talk about them. So that's what I call hermeneutical empowerment, right? And in the book, I use the notion of echoing for both of these things. When you echo other voices, it's not even that you necessarily agree with them or that you feel like you are exactly in their position, but you are saying, no, I want to echo this voice that has been lost, that is not believed, or, the second point, or that is not receiving any uptake in the language that they use or whatever. Okay. And then finally, for the last one, we need another form of empowerment, which is communicative empowerment. You need to empower those who have been marginalized in communication so that they can speak, so that they are heard, so that they have a space in our communicative practices. You can also call it more generally epistemic empowerment. Okay, so far so good? Okay, I want to make sure that everybody is at least following this. It will become more specific in a minute. So this is what I'm calling epistemic activism. And the general way of understanding epistemic activism is as that form of activism or activist practices that have to do with interventions that try to epistemically empower the oppressed, and interventions that try to resist the communicative marginalization of the oppressed. They try to resist social invisibility and social silence. Okay, but now let me start complicating this as I go. So we have first the problem of social invisibility and social inaudibility, but then at the same time, it's not clear that when you become visible and audible, when you can speak and you can be seen, then the problems are going to disappear, because oppression doesn't work that way, right? So at the same time, you have the problem of defective visibility and defective audibility. You can become visible, but in a way that goes against you, because you are stigmatized, you are demonized, before you were not seeing, and now you're seeing as a threat, as a problem, right? Think about the queer movement. And I'll say more about this in a minute. Being in the closet, being out of the closet. But also think about how people of color have been demonized in racist societies. So sometimes they were not seeing at all. Sometimes they were seeing only as a problem or as a threat. So you are trapped in this problem, right? Sometimes you may prefer to be invisible than to be hyper-visible to protect yourself or whatever. But obviously you want to get rid of both, right? And notice, even though this is part of the recent discussion, and I'll tell you more about the recent literature on this, this is already on the table in one of the feminist critical theories who have an account of oppression. And this is Iris Marion Young. She said, the culturally dominated undergo a paradoxical oppression in that they are both marked out by stereotypes and at the same time rendered invisible. So that last part of the sentence is making very clear that on the one hand, you can be hyper-visible because you are marked out by these negative stereotypes, but at the same time, you can be invisible nonetheless. Oops. And I think the very idea of the closet, right, which again is another term and another concept that comes from the queer movement for liberatory reasons, but that concept of the closet is trying to explain that. On the one hand, in a homophobic society and in a transphobic society, people are encouraged, sometimes literally forced, to be in the closet, to remain in the closet, to remain invisible as a queer person, as a trans person. But at the same time, as soon as they come out of the closet, they become hyper-visible in all kinds of problematic ways, right? And we need to get rid of that. What that means, obviously, is that there is an oppressive double bind here. I'm using the work of Sukaina Hirji in that article from 2022, in which she gives an account of this. And she says, look, a lot of the time oppressed people felt like either they have to hide or they have to be visible and vocal in a way that goes against them. That means that the resistant agency is either blocked, the first part of the double bind, or at least undermined, or is subverted and co-opted so that it goes against them, right? So, for example, she says in particular, she has many examples in the paper, but one of them is about black women or women of color more generally. And she says a lot of the time, and in academic context, and she says a lot of the time, women of color are really strongly encouraged not to say anything, not to protest about certain things. But then when they do, it goes against them because they are perceived as hysterical, oversensitive, a complainer, blah, 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 a whiner, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And this is one of the shapes that agential epistemic injustice takes, right? It takes you into a trap that either you don't exercise your agency at all, or you do exercise your agency, but it doesn't empower you, and it doesn't lead to any kind of liberation. Okay. So what is needed is a double task here, meaning we have to fight at the same time against social invisibility and silencing and hypervisibility and distorted audibility. And another point that is very important, because these things are structural and systematic, there are social structures that are putting these traps in place. And it's happening systematically to everyone. This cannot be a fight for the individual as new situations arise, because then the problem is going to keep occurring anyway. So it has to be a collective task, a collective form of resistance. But actually, it's even more complicated than that, because it's not only that you're fighting against social invisibility and hypervisibility of the people who are oppressed. In a way, in an indirect way, you are also fighting against what comes as mainstream visibility or audibility. That is the default, so to speak, right? Let me tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that. But what I want to say is that it's actually a triple task. Oops. Okay, so we have these two tasks, but the third one that we have that goes along with the first two is that you also have to resist not only the invisibility and hypervisibility of the oppressed, but also the privileged visibility of the people who don't have a problem with visibility, the privileged audibility of the people who don't have a problem being heard. And another way to put it is that you have to fight against the epistemic control of public discourse and the epistemic control of the social imagination. And again, I claim that this is the way we should understand epistemic activism, doing these three things at the same time, and doing it in a collective way, so that communities of resistance are formed, and people do this together in a consistent, concerted way. And let me give you an example of that comes from queer activism. And I hope that, which is a key thing, right, from the 1980s in San Francisco. And I hope this example illustrates the three things I was telling you about in this slide. So at the time, right, in the, throughout the 20th century, but even up to the 80s, queer people were socially invisible. They couldn't kiss in public. They couldn't be seen in public in a normal way. In fact, they were being harassed all the time when they were being seen in this way. And in fact, I don't know if any of you know this, but the history of the kissing is supposed to start in New York in the late 80s and early 90s. This actually is prior to that, because people were being harassed in some bars at the Village, in particular one bar, Floaties, and they were kicked out or they were being harassed. So they decided to go there in big numbers and start kissing, right? And notice what happens when that was done, right? A bar that was, like most bars at the time, like almost any bar, even in New York, a heteronormative space that was not friendly to queer people, was in fact actively hostile against queer people, for a little bit before they were kicked out and before they had a backlash, was transformed by these people kissing together into a safe place for same-sex couples to kiss, because they just made it so. They came together, they did it together. Imagine how empowering that would be, right? Imagine how transformative that would be. On the one hand, you're saying, we're not going to be invisible anymore, right? But on the other hand, you're also saying, and we're not going to be hyper-visible as a target of attack with impunity. We're going to become visible in our own terms, in the way in which we want to do it together, and hopefully you will not perceive us as monsters or perverts or a social threat. You will perceive us in another way. And also we're showing you that you were taking for granted that some people could kiss in this bar or in this corner, right? And other people couldn't. So we are unmasking that public spaces, like this corner, or private spaces of some sort, like a bar, are actually heteronormative spaces. You just don't even think about it. You take it for granted that if you're straight, you don't have to worry about it, right? You take it for granted that if you're straight, you don't have a closet that you have to come in and out of. You don't have to come out as a straight person. We are unmasking the privilege that you have because you control the social dynamics of visibility and audibility. So we're doing all those three things, including the third one. Well, we're doing them at the same time together, right? Notice another thing that I'm going to mention about this, because in the second part of the talk, and I'll go faster, I'm gonna say more about that if I can, which is, in my view, of course, this is something that you do in public. Of course, this is an interaction that you have with other groups. But it's not all about the general mainstream society, the general public or mainstream culture, or about other groups. It's also about your group. Because what you're trying to do is to mobilize people, to create a public, a counter-public, to make sure that people come together and they have a voice. In a way, this is already successful in that sense, right? Now, what reaction are you going to have? They knew in the New York bar that I told you about that they were going to be kicked out. And they were not going to transform that particular bar into a queer bar forever, right? Here, too, they knew that the streets of San Francisco were not going to be transformed like immediately and forever. They knew it was going to be dangerous for them to kiss the next day. They knew probably that they were not going to persuade the general public, and they were not going to change minds and hearts, as we were talking earlier, right? They were not going to create a new sensibility automatically, immediately. But nonetheless, there was something that was already successful here. There was something about this resistance that was already empowering. There was this form of empowerment, including communicative and epistemic empowerment, that was taking place already here. Okay. Now let me go with that in mind to the second part of the talk, and I'll move faster. How to resist the oppressive double binds, and especially the one about invisibility and hypervisibility, being silenced or being hyper-audible. Well, one way of doing it is through protest. And what do we do when we protest? The standard view of protest, which of course I reject, which is still the standard view today, not only in political philosophy, but in political theory, in political science, is that what you're trying to do when you protest is you're trying to persuade people. You're trying to change minds and hearts. You're trying to make sure that if people believed A, or had the commitment A, you are going to convince them that they shouldn't. They should have belief B or commitment B. So for example, with respect to homophobia, if they thought that all gay people were perverts and monsters and so on, you may want to convince them that that's not true and that they should change their beliefs and so on. The problem with this view is that, of course, this is one thing that protest does, and I don't deny that. But it's only one among the many things that protest can do. It's not even the main thing that protest does. There are other things that protest can do. In particular, beyond public persuasion, what protest does is social mobilization. And that means the creation of a community, the creation of a public, the creation of a collective, the creation of a collective voice. And that is already crucial, right? It also has the possibility of empowering the members of that community so that you don't feel threatened, so that you don't feel inhibited anymore, so that you have the strength to come out. I can tell you more, for example, about how empowering it was for me when I moved to Chicago in 1990, and I was like, oh my God, not only I can be in a city in which I can feel safe as a queer person, there are also all these queer protests going on, and I can participate in them, and there are kissings, and there are all these things going on. Like, oh my God, right? That was incredibly empowering for me. And that is a crucial part of protest as well, right? Now, notice another thing, that if you don't take that into account, that there is more to protest than persuasion, that protest is also a mechanism of self-empowerment, that protest is also a mechanism of group formation. If you don't take into account these other things, then you are in the predicament that many political philosophers and political theorists have been, namely, they don't even understand why people try to protest if they know they are not going to persuade anybody, right? Even part of the dispute between Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, right, in the 19th century was about that. Like Booker T. Washington was like, we shouldn't protest. Like, we're not going to change people's minds if they're racist. What's the point of protesting? Du Bois famously said, I'm still going to protest even if I don't persuade anybody. I'm doing it for me. We should do it for us. It is about self-dignity, and it is about self-affirmation. So it connects with this point, right? Of course you should protest, even if you're not going to change the mind of your current fellow citizens, even if you're not going to change the mind of the government, even if you're not going to change the mind of anybody outside your group, you should still protest. And we can go back to that. But what I'm offering is a self-empowerment view of protest that has distinctive features and can explain why protest movements take off, what they try to do, and so on. So let's go back to this and what is going on here. Did these people think, these protesters, these queer activists, did they think that we're going to show up at the corner, we're going to kiss in big numbers, and then all the homophobes are going to change their minds? We're going to persuade them, right? They're going to be convinced. Like, automatically, they're going to have an epiphany, and they're going to be convinced. Well, clearly not, right? They didn't think that. But why were they doing it anyway? There is also, further, the problem of the backlash. Not only you're not going to convince anybody, right? You're not going to be liberated. You're not going to achieve anything. People are going to be even redoubling their homophobic reactions. They're going to be even more disgusted by you. Yes, that can happen. But nonetheless, in some situations, and I'll come back to this point, a backlash is worth having. You may want to have the disgust, the fear, all of that out in the open so that you can start fighting it in another way. And this is part of what I call, in the philosophy of protest and in activism, creating friction. And it is the kind of friction that you want to create so that at least some people, even if it is a minority, or eventually, even if it is not now, but in 10 years from now, or the next generation, at least some people will start questioning their affective reactions and their epistemic reactions. They will start questioning, why do I think that all queer people are like this? Or why do I think that? And why are these people, so mad about it? What is going on? Okay. So that's part of what I argue for. There has to be friction. Not persuasion, but friction. And the friction, ultimately, you want to use for changes that are not just changing one belief at a time or one commitment at a time, but changing an entire sensibility, a way of feeling and connecting with other people, as Braden was saying in their own presentation. So all of that is crucial. So going back to the double bind of invisibility and hypervisibility, in both a critical philosophy of race and queer theory, queer philosophy, we have an entire literature on invisibility, of course, that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We also have an entire literature on hypervisibility, right? So there have been a lot of people in academia, but also in activism outside academia, that have recognized that we have to fight these two things at the same time. I would claim, if you go back to the history of the civil rights movement and anti-racist activism, that even in very famous demonstrations, in this case, the I Am a Man March, in connection with the sanitation strike in 1968, there was something like that going on. On the one hand, sanitation workers were socially invisible. People didn't even pay any attention to them. They had to become visible, but they had to become visible in their own terms, not hyper-visible in this negative way, but in a way that was empowering for them. Then there has been a lot of that, I would claim, more recently in Black Lives Matter. For example, in the hoodie campaign in solidarity with Trayvon Martin, right? We wanted, those of us who participated in this campaign, we wanted to call visibility on Trayvon Martin, but not in a way that becomes a spectacle or a hyper-visibility that doesn't go anywhere, but in a way that shows that we are dealing with a social imagination that transforms the perception of a child, right, into this potential criminal or whatever. And you're trying to change that, the dynamics of social visibility in that way, so that black kids are not either invisible or hypervisible. And that's another image of that. Again, you know, the big assembles of people of color, black people, during Black Lives Matter's demonstration, again, is a way of achieving collective visibility in a way that is trying to undermine also hypervisibility. All right. So the idea is to answer this question, right? How do we repair and resist the epistemic harms that come with both invisibility and hypervisibility at the same time? How do we restore and guarantee the epistemic dignity and agency of oppressed people so that they can control their own self-presentation and they are not at the mercy of how other people either invisibilize them or present them in ways that are detrimental to their well-being? And social movements obviously have done this. Social movements have answers to this question. And part of that answer is what is called visibility actions or pride actions, right? So let me tell you a little bit about those and how, in my view at least, they are protest actions that aim at epistemic empowerment. And what do I mean by epistemic empowerment? So let me say just a little bit about this. Epistemic empowerment, I claim, is a right that everybody has, and collectives, it can also be a collective right that people have, and oppressed people, right, need to be protected to achieve this right. What is the right to be epistemically empowered? To be empowered, to have a voice, to have social visibility, but also, the last 2 points here, to be empowered to control your own visibility or invisibility, your own audibility or inaudibility. And notice, not only you should have this formal right or abstract right, you should have actually material spaces and material practices in which you can exercise that right. So that there are actually material spaces and material practices where you can be seen and heard in your own terms. This actually, there is a whole story here. I could spend like 20 minutes on this, which I'm not gonna. But there is a whole story here in social epistemology which has to do with the literature around prison activism and the problems and epistemic harms in the American criminal justice system. So my colleague Jennifer Lucky, I will not speak for 20 minutes on this, but I'll tell you something in a minute. So my colleague Jennifer Lucky, dealing with these issues about incarceration and how incarcerated people are either invisible, right? They are put in a prison and society forgets about them, or they are hypervisible only as criminals, right? So she came up with this idea, which I partially agree with, which is, well, they have the right to be known in their own terms. They have the right to have their stories heard, you know, they have the right to tell their story. And I agree with that, but the reason why I want to change it a little bit is that, yes, they do have the right to be seen and to be heard and to be known, but they also have the right not to be seen or not to be heard as an incarcerated person or as a formerly incarcerated person. In other words, institutions, in my view, don't have the right to ask for your criminal records, because then you're in a position that you can never get a job, you can never get decent housing, because people, employers and people who rent apartments or sell apartments have the right to ask you if you were ever incarcerated. So the twist that I gave to this is like, well, yeah, of course you want to control your visibility, but you also want to control your invisibility, right? So anyway, there is an entire story here, but the point is that you should have agency and control over the way in which you are known or unknown, the way in which you are visible or invisible, and so on. Okay. Okay, so back to visibility actions and solidarity actions in the history of protests and in the history of different social movements, in particular anti-racist and queer movements. So what they try to do is to resist invisibility and hypervisibility at the same time, social silencing and distorting stigmatization. They also try to support the agency of the oppressed so that they can make themselves visible and audible. Notice that the first point is about repairing a harm. There has been a harm already. You were invisibilized or you were hypervisibilized, and that has to be repaired. But it goes beyond that because we want people to be empowered so that that doesn't have to happen again. So this is not just reparative justice, it's transformative justice, and it has to do with empowerment. And it also has to do not only with empowering those who have been marginalized, but also actually disempowering those who have been disproportionately empowered, decentering those who have control the center of public life. And these are different ways in which this has been done with visibility actions and solidarity actions. I'll start with the migrant movement and migrant protests and A Day Without Immigrants. And then I'll move from there to queer activism, and then finally Black Lives Matter. And if I have time, maybe I'll say something about feminist activism. So many of you, especially if you are old enough, will remember the really well-attended big demonstrations in the so-called A Day Without Immigrants. It happened in many cities, not only in LA, but Chicago, many other cities. They were huge. One of the biggest ones is this one from 2006, in which the entire city of LA couldn't function because they couldn't have restaurants open. They couldn't have hotels functioning. They couldn't have pretty much any business in the service industry because there were no workers, because they were all here demonstrating. And what that shows to begin with is like the migrant community is the support of the city. The city cannot function without them, right? It shows that they have solidarity with one another. It shows many things, right? It also managed to create visibility while at the same time it was so big that everybody was there. It was very difficult to identify people, to single out people, to deport people or anything like that. Now it's interesting that now we are, right now, in the present conditions, in a situation in which immigrants in general, and of course undocumented immigrants in particular, are even more threatened than they were back then, 2 decades ago. And nonetheless, there is nothing like this going on. Not only that, it would be very difficult for something like this to happen. And not only that, even if it were to happen, it is very likely that the people participating in demonstrations like this would be targeted and they could be punished. And we can talk about everything that is being, that has been happening and is still ongoing about the punishment of people participating in protests, including campus protests, including the ones that happened a year ago, but they are still persecuting those. Okay. So we can come back to that, but this is an interesting example that connects with what I was saying about changing the dynamics of social visibility. This is the example I already told you about, and I want to connect this image with the following ones. So this image is actually part of the Stonewall riots, right? The Stonewall riots actually are depicted sometimes of people throwing rocks at the police. And of course that did happen and that's crucial. But it included an Occupy movement. They actually occupied Christopher Street for weeks, 4 weeks. As they did that, like in this case, they created images for themselves, right? As they did that, some of the images like this one include same-sex kissing, right, and queer kissing. You see all these different, I mean, there are at least 3, right, over there, there. My pointer is not working, so that's why I have to go, right. So to me, this is a key thing, which is interesting too, right, that you can have this really complex kind of protest action that is happening. But notice that here, and also here, there is some gender diversity, right? There is some racial diversity. Here, however, there are a bunch of hairy white guys kissing, right? In the streets of Toronto, apparently. I didn't know, I found this image, but I couldn't tell where it was, and I gave this talk last year in Toronto, and people were like, this is here, actually. Okay, so the reason why I also want to call attention to the lack of diversity here as compared to the other key scenes is obviously not because there is something wrong with this or I'm against it. I mean, this is great. I mean, hairy white guys need love too, and good for them, you know. I'm all fine. But one thing to pay attention to is that when you see a protest movement that doesn't include other voices or that is more specific, even if it is great, right? You should be careful because this way of empowering themselves or liberating themselves or making any progress may work only for them and not necessarily for people who are not men or people who are not white or people and so on. And notice, for example, this other kissing much later that could very well be an ad, for Calvin Klein or something. I mean, it's not, it's a kissing, but like now you have only really well-dressed, upper-class, stylish white men kissing. And it's commercial, and it's co-opted, and it becomes part of the mainstream. And you may think, oh, we actually reached the mainstream, so we're good. We're good to go. We're empowered and liberated. Actually, not necessarily. Just because these people who present themselves in this particular way receive a kind of social acceptance that they didn't have before, that doesn't necessarily result in the empowerment and liberation of every part of the community. We can come back to that. Okay, now let me shift so that I get to the end and we can have time for discussion. To the 1980s and ACT UP. So it's still queer activism, but it's not about public kissing or anything like that. It's about, at the time, the social epidemic that was going on with HIV/AIDS and the fact that there was complete social apathy. The government was doing next to nothing. And on top of that, in the mid-'80s especially, they started demonizing even more the queer community, saying that it's their fault, they're very promiscuous, oh, it's too bad, or you brought it upon yourself, this and that and the other thing. And at some point, and there have been queer protests all along, and vigils, and all kinds of civil protests, and at some point, ACT UP was formed, and ACT UP said this, right? Maybe we have to be uncivil. Maybe it's not about persuading our fellow citizens. Maybe it is about making them even more mad. Maybe it is about confronting them, and what I call creating friction. And they said, remember Stonewall, the image, the kissing of Occupy, Christopher Street, and so on. That was obviously much earlier, but they're saying, well, maybe we have to go back to that. Maybe we have to go back to throwing bricks and also making people uncomfortable. And they were in your face, stopping traffic, stopping the life of the city. They did all the famous and spectacular die-ins like this one or this one. And then also, which is one of the reasons why I'm bringing this in, there was this really interesting communication across protest movements, which is also something very interesting, that they are learning from each other, they are supporting each other, they are borrowing from each other. After ACT UP, Queer Nation was created. Queer Nation was modeled after Black Nation. Queer Nation, as well as ACT UP, was learning and taking things from the civil rights movement, right, and from anti-racist protest. And then, of course, Black Lives Matter coming after this. Well, this is still the 80s, and obviously ACT UP, and the silence equal death, which of course silence equal death is part of the epistemic activism that I'm trying to call attention to. But then after this, die-ins, we have the Black Lives Matter die-ins, right, in the 2000s. 2014 was the biggest one, right, in the Mall of America. But notice one thing. Initially, the Black Lives Matter die-ins were predominantly black people or black and brown people. Here already in 2014, you see a lot of white people, which is good to have solidarity. But then you also have to start thinking, how do we do this together, right? How do white people show solidarity for BLM, and how do they participate in protests in a way that empower black voices and black visibility and not themselves or something about their own voices or visibility. And this is one of the famous images from that dying, this little kid. But notice how people engaged with him, which is kind of disturbing, right? They were more concerned about, posting this thing on the internet than anything else. And there is this spectatorial relationship, like I'm still a spectator, and that contributes to the dying to become a spectacle that could be counterproductive, that is not doing precisely what I'm claiming should do, namely to empower black visibility and black voices, and to ultimately lead to the self-empowerment of the black community. Okay, this is changing. This is the last thing before I conclude. The die-ins also were used later, and it's still ongoing, by black feminist movements in Latin America. This is in Mexico, but it actually started in Argentina. But in many Latin American countries, they use the die-ins to call attention to femicides and the gender-based assassination of a lot of women in particular spaces in Mexico, in Argentina, in Costa Rica, in particular countries. So that is a way of calling attention to that. This is another image. This one is from El Palacio de Justicia de Argentina, the Palace of Justice in Buenos Aires in Argentina. So it's very spectacular, right? It has this shocking effect. It tries to disrupt social apathy, and it tries to show that it is a collective problem, that is urgent, that is a crisis, that we have to attend to it right now. And this is another image, but now without bodies, now trying to do an artistic intervention of a different kind. But it connects with something I've been writing on recently, which is what I call aesthetic activism. And Maria del Rosario Acosta Lopez, who is a Colombian philosopher, she also uses this term, aesthetic activism, that connects with epistemic friction and affective friction of the kind I was telling you about, but now using public installations, public art, in a way to do that. Okay, so let me just go to the conclusions. I'm hoping, even though I have jumped from one thing to another and I have gone too fast sometimes, that I have convinced you, or at least given you some reason to think. First, that we owe communicative solidarity to people who face epistemic injustices, oppressed groups who have a hard time creating a public, being heard, being seen. So we all, even if we don't fall into one of those oppressed groups, my claim is that we should all not be complicit with their social invisibility and inaudibility. We should all try to do something about it. We should all give communicative solidarity to those who cannot be seen or heard, or who are hyper-visible and hyper-audible in distorting ways. But then also, the more important thing is that we need to intervene and we need to participate in epistemic activism and engage in practices of epistemic activism in a way that is empowering to those who are oppressed. Not in a way that, creates a benefit for other people or creates another kind of effect, but in a way that is empowering for them, so that the goal should be that they ultimately have more self-control over their own visibility and audibility. And they have not only the recognition of their right to be epistemically empowered, but actually the ability to exercise that right in practices and spaces in the public sphere. And finally, that one way of doing that, the way I'm suggesting we can do that, and we can see how that was done with visibility actions, with pride actions, for example, in the history of activism, is through what I call epistemic activism, which is not only visibility and solidarity actions, but any kind of protest actions that promote the dignified visibility and audibility of the oppressed, and the creation of a community of resistance against defective dynamics of visibility and audibility, and ultimately facilitate the epistemic empowerment of the oppressed. So I'll stop there. Thank you. So we still have time. We still have time, right? Yeah. My life.
Oh, thank you. Hello. Is it on? Okay. I don't know if it's on.
Oh my God, look at the line. That's exciting.
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me? Is it on? Yeah. Okay. Hi. Thank you, Dr. Medina, for that. That was wonderful. So my question is, when creating collective resistance, how do we balance creating friction through visibility and or with testimonial smothering as a form of survival? Did that make sense? So how
testimonial smothering as a form of survival. Tell me more about that.
Yeah. I don't know if that's the correct framing of it, but how do we balance wanting to control our visibility and some people within the community and the collective wanting to be visible with those who feel like they have to be invisible for survival reasons.
I love that. Yes. Should I go ahead and answer that? Okay. So, well, I mean, there are so many questions. I thought that maybe we're taking 2 or 3 questions at a time, but I guess okay. Because I do want to get till the end of the line. Okay. So I agree with you. That's a huge problem. It's a problem that not only, social philosophers and political philosophers have addressed, but actually more activists have been concerned about that problem. So let me tell you this, for example, that I think will address at least one version of what you're saying. In the history of queer activism, right? There was a time, even in the 50s already, like early in the queer movement in the US, that outing people, right, was one of the techniques that queer activists used. So in that way, you bring people out of the closet like, no, you're gay, right? I'm going to out you, right? But there is a huge ethical and political problem with that, as you're suggesting, namely, wait, why are you outing me? That should be up to me. You don't have the right to out me. Now you are making me vulnerable for all kinds of reasons, right? Like, for example, issues of survival. Like, well, I live in a little town, or, or my neighbors are really homophobic, or whatever the case may be. Like, you are endangering even my survival to do that, right? And I agree with that. That's why I'm putting the emphasis on self-control. You're obviously not allowed to use people as sacrificial lambs for the movement. For the sake of collective visibility and collective audibility, you cannot force people to become visible and audible if they don't want to be. However, even though that is my view, and I'm saying, no, there are all kinds of ways of bringing people into the movement, mobilizing them, encouraging them to participate in any way they can, and sometimes they cannot. There are limits to that, as you're saying, right? And we have to be realistic, and we have to be very conscious of what the real situation is. However, with that being said, I am nonetheless torn about outing, for example, because yes, I do think that sometimes queer activists went too far when they outed some people, but at the same time, know that in some of the famous cases, right, they outed Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn, right, was not only, absolutely complicit with the persecution of gay and lesbian people. He was one of the people who were at the core of the so-called Lavender Scare. Roy Cohn decided, he didn't have to, and by the way, Roy Cohn was the famous lawyer who was the mentor of Donald Trump, which is interesting. So Roy Cohn decided that he was going to advise this Republican senator and other people in D.C. So that they were forced out of the closet, all those queer people in D.C., and they were going to be out of a job. So they were going to fire. So now, as you probably know, he was gay. He tried to remain in the closet as he was dying of AIDS, which he did die of AIDS. And, it was really, but if you're outing people yourself, if you're not only complicit, but actively involved in the persecution of a particular oppressed group, I mean, that is a case in which it's not clear that the community owes you anything, right? But you're right, it is very difficult because the collective visibility has to be balanced with the individual visibility or invisibility that people choose to have. Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
No, that was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for coming to talk today, and I think you gave a lot of exceptional examples of protests. But one form of protest that I did not see in your slideshow was violent protests. So do you believe that violent protests can be utilized to achieve epistemic empowerment?
Thank you. That's a great question. Joanna, where are you? I'm going to pass the mic to Joanna, who has a great paper on this. So, I mean, it's a very good question, and it's a very complicated question. So, I think it is a problem when we raise that question as either you for or against violence in protest, because then you have these polarized options that either you are a saint, right, and you are for the purity of action, like I will not ever engage in any kind of protest that is violent in any way, right, or the other extreme, or you are all for violence and you're just fine with using violence in any way that is advantageous to you. I don't agree with either of those extremes, and in fact, I don't think that any, nuanced political philosopher, even Martin Luther King Jr., agrees with that, right? Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I understand riots. I understand, that people have violent reactions, that sometimes they have to be used. I just want to say that we have to achieve the less violent course of action possible," and so on and so forth. So anyway, I'm neither against nor for violence in an absolute way. However, that means that there are all kinds of intermediate options, and it is a very contextual question. The context will determine whether or not you are using violence in a way that should be allowed, that is legitimate, that is proportional to the threat. And the reason why I gestured toward Joanna is because she has a wonderful paper on this, and we were discussing this earlier. But in some of the cases I'm talking about, notice, we are talking about really extreme conditions. I mean, not slavery, not colonial subordination, but nonetheless, we're talking about an epidemic, the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, in which people started dying by the hundreds, then by the thousands, and it was getting worse and worse, and nobody was doing anything. That's really extreme, right? So yes, you should be able to engage in the destruction of property. You should, as ACT did, you should be able to engage in emotional violence, symbolic violence, as they did, right? And then in other cases like BLM, we're talking about people being brutalized by the police and being killed by the police. And in prison activism, we're dealing with really extreme conditions. So yeah, I do think that violence is not out of the question. Violence should be on the table. But it's not whether we use it, it's how we use it, is which kind of violence we're going to use. So that's the beginning of an answer. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor Medina, or Jose, if we've leveled up after.
Yeah, please.
I think one of the questions I had about your framing is about modulations of the invisibility and ways that can have a strategic function. It seems that in a lot of protest movements, for example, in the 2020 BLM protests, that there was a lot of guidance being issued by activists for, primarily protesters of color to be a part of the center, more of the vanguard of a protest kind of body, and to have, white and more privileged people flanking them at the side because they're less likely to be brutalized by police forces. And so I think there's a clear political and strategic function there of what that's doing as a matter of physical safety. But within your broader framework, are you saying that there's more room for activist movements to be more intentionally doing things like that have an aesthetic function as well, of what is that visibly signaling, and just how can activist movements kind of take up that call of the triple task of epistemic activism in things that they seem to be doing sort of already? Where's there room to maybe increase the intensity in that regard?
I think the activists are doing it already, and I think activists, organizers have actually thought about these issues for a long time, and I think it is an aesthetic issue, right? In philosophy, Jacques Rancière, for example, has this account of the redistribution of the sensible, the economy of the sensible, what is visible, what is audible, and so on. That is being rearranged by protest, right? But then, as you said, how differently positioned people, differently situated people, can become themselves visible in the protest becomes a tricky thing. For example, the white participation in a BLM protest, right? And most of the time, the organizers and the spokespersons for BLM didn't say, don't come to the protest at all, but they did say, well, you have to give center stage to people of color. You shouldn't participate in this way, for example. The naked yogi, famous in Portland, right? The white lady striking yoga poses naked. What was the problem with that? That the BLM protest became all about her, because her images were the most sensational and the ones that people were most interested in and they wanted to capture. And people like Mundane said about the naked Athena, right? I don't see in her a brave ally of the cause, but something else, a beneficiary of white privilege dancing vainly on a stage that was originally created to rise up the voices of the oppressed brothers and sisters. So, I mean, this is an example of the problem, right? Which is not to say she cannot come and she shouldn't be there or she shouldn't be visible at all, but you have to modulate your visibility with respect to your positionality and who you're trying to empower or be in solidarity with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask another question about hypervisibility. It seems like in the environment of today's activism, a lot of hypervisibility is mediated through the mass media. So, for instance, like if I were to go to, say, the Kiss-In protest, I can control myself, and that space is one thing, but then anything I do with that space could be photographed or shared by an observer, and used to say, "Oh, look at this perverted. There are probably kids around," and that seems like obviously that's always been the case, but it seems more severe and more dominant now in a social media environment and harder to control. So I'm curious how you do a protest when anything you do in that protest can be severed from its context and made to look like a hostile thing that you might not intend it to.
Yeah, no, that is a great question. And I mean, I've written a little bit about social media in relation to activism. I have a colleague at Northwestern, not in my department, but in performance studies, Marcela Fuentes, who has an entire account about how to connect offline protests with online protests and how to connect what is happening on the streets with what is happening in social media, which is not easy, as you said. Things have become way more complex and difficult to control, because it used to be the case, right, decades ago, before you were born, before internet, right, that people thought, okay, essentially it's about mass media, like TV channels, the radio, the newspapers. If we get the attention of the journalists, right, the reporters and so on, then society is going to pay attention to us. We can figure out how to get the right kind of attention sometimes, from the TV channels. But as you said, now it's way more complicated, because it's not just about these TV channels, these news radio. It is about anybody who has a phone, right? And anybody who has the capacity to create images that they can post online, that they can become viral. And then also it is about the platforms, right? The social media platforms, and what they're going to do, and whether they have filters, whether they have any kind of content moderation. There is a problem also of the deep fakes, right? That they can alter the image. I mean, there are all kinds of problems that we didn't have before that now we do with this technology. I do agree with everything you said. I don't think the conclusion to that should be, oh my God, it's so risky that we better not. No, I know you didn't say that, but someone could say, oh my God, you're right? If I participate in a protest, it is so incredibly risky. I may not be doing anything beneficial to anybody. I don't think we should do that. I think we should have to become more sophisticated about how to stage a protest, how to participate in it. We also have to talk about responsibility for the use of technology that JJ was talking about earlier. So yeah, that complicates everything. But yeah, thank you for the question.
I think sorry, can I add something?
Sure.
I think it doesn't complicate the sort of the part of the protest that isn't visibility. It doesn't contest the part that you mentioned, that it was two things, right? Like the claiming of space.
Right.
Also, in the existing in community with other people, you can still do that no matter what other people do.
Exactly. Yeah. No, thank you. That's a good point. Yeah.
Hi, Professor Medina. I have a question that kind of relates to the previous one. In your analysis, how does globalization, through its technological, economic, and cultural forces, affect the potential for resistance movements? Do you believe that globalization offers new opportunities for cross-border solidarity and resistance, and/or does it create new forms of oppression that complicate traditional protest tactics? Do you see limits to liberal democracy in confronting systemic oppression? Sorry if that's a loaded question.
No. It's great. Yeah. No, I think you are absolutely right. And I didn't talk about this, but even though I didn't talk about this, some of the examples that I showed image of have a transnational, or if you want to put it that way, global dimension. For example, the last one, right? Ni Una Menos, even though it was created in Argentina, is a transnational feminist movement doing die-ins and other things, in many, many Latin American countries. Obviously, Black Lives Matter started in the US, but it connected immediately with a global anti-racist movement. And in fact, Black Lives Matter itself created chapters in many different countries. even act up, right? Because obviously the AIDS epidemic was happening not only in the US, it was happening in many other countries, in Europe, in South Africa, in many other African countries. There were chapters of ACT UP that were created in many cities outside the US, in other countries. So you're absolutely right. A lot of the forms of oppression that we're talking about, right, are really global. Racism, women's oppression. And it is important to connect people in different parts of the globe, right? And how do we do that? We can do that in all kinds of ways. I mean, the previous question suggested that there are all these technologies that create problems for us, but they also create opportunities. Now it is easier to communicate online, to create connections between different activist organizations so that you can be both local and global at the same time. And I think both things are important, to remain local and rooted in the context that you live in, your community lives in, but to connect with other communities and to share with them, like strategies, solidarity, and so on.
Thank you.
I'm happy to take 2 or 3 questions at a time so that they can ask their questions and I'll do my best. Yeah.
Lizzie. Okay. So I wanted to bring up one of the points you made earlier that you slightly touched on about when you were showing the kissin' photos and you showed the one that just had the white hairy man, as you said. And I was thinking about like how nowadays a lot of the time we kind of see oppression within oppressed groups, specifically the queer community a lot. I think that a lot of queer people end up being very discriminatory towards like trans people, especially those who are non-binary or use neo-pronouns and such like that. And it made me think about your, and excuse me if I say this incorrectly, but the hermeneutical empowerment that you were talking about bringing in language. And I immediately thought about like neo-pronouns and things like that, of that nature. And I was wondering, like, what do you think is the next best step when we already have so much hate from other communities, but now we're kind of hating within our own community by being like, I'm the normal gay person. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. I've seen that a lot in today's culture. And so as somebody who is non-binary, like that's a very upsetting thing to see. And I don't know how to like move forward with the community like that. Yeah.
Mine kind of goes along with that a little bit. Sorry. How does your theory of epistemic activism kind of transcend the inherent obscenity that comes with creating a counterpublic?
The inherent obscenity that comes with creating a counterpublic. Yes, that's a very good question. Okay, should I go ahead and answer those 2? Or? Okay. So yeah, Lizzie, is that your name, Lizzie? Yes, that's a great question. And actually in the history of activism, pretty much in every movement of liberation, you do have this problem, this internal problem, so that the community, while trying to liberate every member of the community, was actually promoting one set of people within the community at the expense of marginalizing others. Even within the civil rights movement, right? Bayard Rustin was asked not to march in the front lines and not to make claims about his gay identity and so on, because that could be a problem for the civil rights movement. Women in the civil rights movement were not empowered. Even the most hyper-visible of women in the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks, she was never asked to speak, right? I mean, there is an entire history there. But you are absolutely right. In the queer movement, it's incredibly problematic, yeah? To begin with, gay people, right? Even were okay, even though the initial queer liberation movement was broader than that. If you start looking, in the early 20th century, even up to the mid 20th century, and actually, before Stonewall, which some people claim, oh, that's the beginning of the queer liberation movement. Well, yeah, but decades later, it was the Copper Donut Union in LA, right? And it was mostly trans women of color. Even if you look at the images from Stonewall, there are many queer people of all kinds, non-binary, trans, Sylvia Rivera, right? Marsha P. Johnson. They are the form. In fact, well, we don't have time and we don't have audio because I thought I was not going to use this. There is this amazing speech that Sylvia Rivera gives in the anniversary of Stonewall, only a few years later, in which she's not allowed to speak. Then she forces herself onto the stage. You can check it out on YouTube, by the way. And then she gives this impassioned speech saying, I can't believe I'm treated this way as a trans person of color who was at the front lines of Stonewall. We are celebrating Stonewall, and now, only a few years later, now it's mostly white gay and lesbian people, right? And now the issues that we were raising about being trans, about being a queer person of color, about housing, about all kinds of, about class and queerness, all these things, like, we're not allowed to talk about those things. What the F, right? So you're absolutely right. Like, this is taking things backwards. Even the way in which eventually, especially in the 70s and 80s, people in the queer community use the straight-gay dichotomy, right? That was oppressive, saying, yes, Americans are either straight or gay. We're gay, right? Well, no, but what about bisexuals? What about pansexual? What about non-sexual? What about trans people who don't see themselves as gay, but nonetheless? I mean, there is this internal exclusion. The way in which we have to deal with that is by making sure that liberation movements remain open and inclusive, and they are always self-interrogating the movement, right? So there is no clear answer to that other than to say you have to keep interrogating whether you're empowering every single member of your community or not. And if there are people who have a good claim about being in your community and they are not represented or they don't feel empowered or you are not including them, you have a problem. And you have to change how you present yourself, how you present the collective, how you work towards this collective visibility, because you're absolutely right. Okay, and now, yes, the obscenity. So I think you're absolutely right. I actually have, if I understand your question correctly, you're absolutely right that when there is a social taboo and you're breaking that taboo, you're speaking about something that cannot be spoken, or you're being seen in a way that culture has decided you cannot be seen, then you're going to be perceived as nonsensical, illegible, a threat, a monster, obscene. So you're absolutely right. A lot of the people seeing, queer couples kissing, they were not transformed at all. A lot of people were like, we were totally right. They are disgusting. And look at what they're doing. And this is obscene. And nobody should be doing this. But I do have a paper that is coming out in a volume with Oxford University Press on uncivil resistance that is exactly about this. That sometimes you need to be uncivil because the norms of civility are making it impossible for you to speak. You have to break the norms of civility. And one aspect of that is obscenity, right? Sometimes you have to be perceived as obscene if you want to assert your own sexual identity. And there is no way around that. So, yeah.
Okay. So recently this year on social media, there is this post going around about a national blackout in protest against the administration and the current goings on in America. And it was criticized heavily for being a mostly social media protest that didn't really cause or create real change because it was online, because it was such a widespread ban of just not buying anything for a day. It didn't really create any real change. But a lot of people defended it under the guise of it empowered people to start protesting, or it created empowerment. And so I guess the question I'm trying to ask is, can the fight for empowerment, or can a protest built on empowerment almost inhibit change? If people protest for empowerment and they kind of feel self-satisfied in doing that, especially on a social media platform that might not have any real motion, can that actually inhibit people from protesting in a way that might be more persuasive? Can those things kind of conflict?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a great case, right? The black boycott and how to assess that. Was it successful? Was it legitimate? Were Were they trying to do this or that? And exactly what you said. If it doesn't have like a noticeable impact, like for example, economic impact, is it right to say, oh, it was for nothing or it was unsuccessful? But exactly as you said, there are so many things that a protest can try to do that just because it doesn't achieve one or it doesn't seem to go very far in one respect, that doesn't mean that the other stuff is not significant and valuable, right? And that connects with the point about Du Bois saying, look, even if the US, even if America is going to continue to be as racist as it has ever been, and even at the time when he was saying this, even if segregation is not going to be dismantled completely, it's still worth it for me to assert my self-dignity. Because by protesting, I take distance from this, moral distance, and I say, I don't tolerate this. This is not with my consent. I take distance from this. I'm against this, right? And then if other people do it, it's a collective act. Like, we are not okay with this, right? We don't tolerate this. We don't stand with the American economy, and we're not going to do things, and we're not going to shut up for the sake of economic prosperity. We're going to do everything we can not to participate in the economy today, for a day. But notice one thing. Not only it may be very important in the sense of asserting your own ethical position, like I'm not complicit with this anymore. Secondly, creating a community, right? I invite other people to do the same, and we're going to remain a community of resistance against this. Not only that, you never know what the impact is going to be, because for good or for bad, because there is a bad side to this as well, protest is not a one-day trip. Protest is not a single fix, a quick fix. Protest is something that has to be sustained again and again. Like, for example, one of the people in philosophy who started talking about boycotts and collective responsibility and using our economic agency not to be complicit with what is going on. And Braden, again, was talking about this, but one of the philosophers earlier today, but one of the philosophers was Iris Marion Young, who was in one of my quotes in the paper. So Iris Marion Young said, we have to engage in boycotts and not buying certain products and not. Now, is that successful only when the industry that you don't want to support anymore economically goes bankrupt? No. Is that successful only when the industry starts losing money and there is a huge economic impact? No. You have to keep doing it, right? And even if initially doesn't seem to be going too far, if you keep doing it, if there is a black boycott that other people join, and if it is continued, and it is repeated periodically, maybe there is a movement there, maybe there is something there. You never know, you have to keep trying, right? The good part about activism is that precisely because you are creating a community and you are creating a path, you can feel like I'm onto something and I can keep participating, and this has durability beyond me. It can be sustained, you know, and sometimes it takes many generations. We're talking about all these movements that are still ongoing, and there were many generations before anything really happened. The bad part about everything I just said, obviously, is protest fatigue and frustration, and sometimes things getting worse, right? I was telling Roxy, I think, earlier today, that I happened to come to DC exactly 8 years ago, in the spring of 2017, when Trump had been inaugurated months earlier to give a talk at George Washington University, and I was talking about how to resist in the next 4 years. And, you know, and now 8 years later, it's like, we are at a much worse situation right now. Like, oh my God, things are going backwards, right? It's like protests and protest movements, including BLM, it's like, some people might feel, oh, it's for nothing. All of this for nothing, right? And I understand that, and protest fatigue is very real, right? And we should not expect that precisely the people who are oppressed will be the one carrying the burden of protesting, right? And of course they're going to be burned out, and of course other people have to take over. And it shouldn't be up to women, and women only, to fight against sexism. And it shouldn't be on the shoulders of trans people, and trans people only, to fight against transphobia. I mean, something else has to be done to address this issue. But you're right, it's not just about the obvious effects and pragmatic outcomes. It has to be broader than that, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.